The stained glass windows of Bishop Marty Memorial Chapel tells much of the story of our Benedictine history, both general history and some of the history of this particular monastery, Sacred Heart Monastery in Yankton, South Dakota. The windows here were designed by three of our sisters, Sister Jerome Schmidt, who was the prioress or leader of the community at the time, Sister Leonarda Longen, who was a rather well-known artist, and Sister Jane Klimisch, a musician and liturgist. Their plans were then designed specifically for stained glass by Erhard Stettner, and the windows were finally executed by the T.C. Esser Company of Milwaukee. The chapel construction was begun in 1948, completed in 1950. So what you see in some of the windows will reflect the life of this monastery at that particular time in history. So any writing that is visible in the windows will be in Latin, which was the language used for Mass and prayer, all the other prayers that were used here at the time. So I will clarify some major ones. Two things you will see repeated. One is the word pax, which appears at the very top of all the side windows, a little banner held by an angel. Pax is Latin for peace, which is considered one important Benedictine motto. Saint Benedict said in his rule, everything in the monastery should be arranged so that people's needs are met, so that everyone may live together in peace. The other phrase you will see several times in Latin, ora et labora, means pray and work. Now, some people refer to that as a Benedictine motto. That's not completely correct. That phrase is nowhere in the Rule of Benedict, actually, but it was very popularly promoted in the 1900s by early American Benedictines, and so you will see that several times in the windows. The first set of windows you'll see we call the parallel windows, because each of them has two parts. The top, with the blue background, is a scene from the Gospels, from the life and ministry of Jesus. The lower part, with the red background, comes from a writing called the Dialogues of Gregory. This was Pope Gregory the Great, who was Pope roughly a half century after the time of Saint Benedict. We should be aware that this writing is called hagiography. That means writings about a holy person. So they're not meant to be taken absolutely literally. They're rather a way of showing that someone was Christ-like, that God worked through this holy person in similar ways that God worked through Jesus. The shape behind the figures in each of the parallel windows is kind of an almond shape. That's called a mandola. And the symbolism behind this, we should imagine two overlapping circles, God's world and our human world. And so where they come together, you get this mandola shape. So everything that's portrayed in these mandolas is an event in which God is at work very specially in our human world through someone. So we begin with the first windows on the north side. At the top is Jesus. The Latin means, I am the good shepherd, from the Gospel of John, where Jesus describes himself that way. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep follow me as they hear my voice. Below, Saint Benedict, who says in his rule, the leader of the monastery, the abbot for men, the prioress for women, should lead not like a king or an emperor or anything of that sort, but in the pattern of the Good Shepherd. So here we see Saint Benedict holding his rule. Sancta Regula means holy rule. And on the left and right, you see the men and women who have followed this rule for 15 centuries. The sisters, you'll notice, are portrayed in the garb of sisters at the time of the building of this church. The second set has to do with dealing with temptation. So at the top, we see Jesus, who several Gospels say went out to the desert to sort of prepare himself for his life of ministry and the message he came to proclaim. And the devil tempted him in several ways to turn aside from his mission. But everything the devil brought up to him, Jesus responded with the words of Scripture. And so the devil did not get his way. The lower portion, one of the stories that Gregory tells us about Benedict, as a very young monk, was looking out his window one day and noticed some of the lovely women walking around, and he experienced a temptation about, should I be living this life of a monk, a hermit, or should I marry? And so to distract himself, he rolled himself around in the thorn bushes, which you see portrayed below. And so again, at the very top, you see the devil does not look very happy because, once again, there is no response to his temptation. In the third window, we see parallel accounts of God working through someone to bring someone new life, whether that be physical life or spiritual life. So at the top, we see portrayed the story about Jesus raising back to life the son of a poor widow who came to beg him for help. And of course, Jesus raises this young man back to life to again be a support to his widowed mother. The story from Gregory below about St. Benedict is shown. The story is that there was a young boy playing near a fence that was in construction, a stone fence, which crumbled and fell and crushed the child. So the distraught father brought his son to St. Benedict, begged him to pray to God to heal his son, which you see Benedict doing, and his son returned to life. The fourth parallel deals with Jesus and Benedict dealing with foreign leaders. At the top, we see the Roman Centurion who came asking Jesus to heal his servant. We should be aware here that the Romans were in power over Jews at the time, and they were therefore not well loved. So for a Roman military leader to come to this humble Jewish preacher was quite astounding. But Jesus responds with mercy and compassion, and his servant, who is even afar away, is healed. Story below, the foreign leader who wants to find out about Benedict was Totila, the leader of the Goths, one of the tribes invading the Roman Empire at the time. And he had heard stories about this holy man, and he wanted to test him out. But when he encountered St. Benedict, Benedict confronted him about how cruelly he was treating many people. And the story is that he also told Totila when he would die, which came to be true. And the story continues that after meeting Benedict, he was not quite as brutal as he had been. Next parallel is not from the stories, entirely from stories of Gregory, but we wanted to include it to indicate some of the history of this particular monastery. Our first sisters came in answer to the call for missionaries to immigrant people in this country in the 19th century and the Native American people. So at the top, we have Jesus, who at the end of Matthew's gospel gathers his disciples, the risen Jesus, and tells them to go into all the world spreading the good news. And that was really the major impetus behind several missionary movements in the history of Christianity. The story that we're told, the lower panel from Benedictine history, is that Pope Gregory, going about the city of Rome at one point, noticed that there were children being sold as slaves. You see the children here in chains. And they were children from what we now call Great Britain, especially England, called Angles at the time. And he said, oh, these are not Angles, these are angels. They should be freed. We need to bring the message of Jesus to all people. So he sent Augustine of Canterbury, who you see in the background on the ship, as the first missionary to the British Isles. And he later became a bishop, so he's already portrayed in the boat in a bishop's mitre with the bishop's staff. So that is to remember our missionary impetus from our beginnings. The next parallel focuses on the notion of obedience. And here we should note that St. Benedict's idea of obedience is very biblical. It's not a military type of obedience. In the Bible, to obey means to really listen to God and to other people and to events and to respond. So from the top, you have the account from St. Luke, who says of Jesus even as a child, after he was lost in the temple and found again, says he went home and he was obedient to Mary and Joseph. So the parallel at the bottom actually continues in the next window. And this returns to some of the stories from the Gregories of Dialogue. The story is about two young monks named Mar and Placid. So here we see Mar listening to the teaching of St. Benedict, listening so he can prepare to respond. What you see happening in the background at the very top of that mandola is the young monk Placid, who has been sent out to the river to get water, and he's fallen in. To be continued in the next window. The next set of parallels somewhat continues the theme of obedience, but particularly focuses on the trust that requires. So at the top, we're reminded of the story of when the disciples of Jesus were out on the water and they see Jesus come walking toward them. And Peter didn't quite believe his eyes and said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to walk across the water to you." And Jesus tells him, and he does. And then he looks down and realizes what's happening and starts to doubt and begins to sink. But he trusts in Jesus, who then lifts him out of the water. The parallel, as Gregory continues the story about Mar and Placid and St. Benedict, is that Benedict realizes from afar what has happened to Placid, that he's in danger of drowning. So he tells Mar to go out and save him. So Mar, who responds immediately in trusting obedience, is out walking across the water to save the young boy without realizing it. And in the background, we see St. Benedict praying for his safety. So you have the trust that is included in obedience. The next parallel, again, is not from the Dialogues of Gregory, but we included, again, to show some of the history of this particular Sacred Heart Monastery. At the top is depicted the story from the Gospels of the wise and foolish virgins, with the imagery of Jesus as bridegroom. And so the story has 10 virgins who come, who are to be part of the wedding party. 5 of them had oil for their lamps, 5 didn't. In other words, 5 were prepared to meet Christ and 5 were not. So the story below is about a German Benedictine nun from the 13th century, St. Gertrude, who is known to be very prepared for the coming of Jesus. She really is the origin of devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So you see in both on her breast and that of Jesus behind her, the burning heart. For her, the heart of Jesus symbolizes his love and mercy and compassion. She's holding in her hand one of the spiritual works that she wrote. And at the bottom of that mandola, you see the seal of the Benedictine congregation that this community belongs to, and St. Gertrude, called Gertrude the Great, is the patron of our congregation, now called Federation. Last 2 parallels, we return again to what we hear from the Dialogues of Gregory. And here again, we have something of Benedict's idea of obedience, that it requires both listening and responding. So the story above from the Gospel is Jesus with his friends Mary and Martha. Mary, who you see in the foreground, is sitting listening to what Jesus has to say and to teach. Behind, you see Mary who is busy at work doing her response of hospitality. So it's not either or. It's not sit and listen all the time and do nothing, nor is it work all the time and not take the time to listen to the words of Jesus. The story below is an interesting one and much beloved of Benedictine women. Benedict was said to have a twin sister named Scholastica, who the Benedictine women consider as their beginning and their patron. And Gregory tells us that once a year, at least, Scholastica used to visit Benedict at his monastery. Now, Benedict had written in his rule it's not good for monks and nuns to wander about, so they did this once a year. And part of what he said was, you should return before nightfall, before evening. So they spend the day, Gregory says, in holy conversation, talking about the spiritual life. And when it begins to get night, Scholastica wants to continue. Benedict says, "Oh no, that's the rule. You have to go back to your monastery." So Scholastica bows her head, prays to God, and then a huge thunderstorm comes up very quickly, which you see portrayed at the top. And she says, rather smugly to Benedict, "Well, go back to your monastery now, if you can." And he says, "My sister, what have you done?" And her response is, "Well, I asked you for a favor." She means a loving act, and you didn't respond. I asked God, and he did respond. Now, Gregory's comment is this: it was right that the woman's prayer should be the prayer that was heard, because her request was made out of love. And the implication here is that love comes before the letter of the law. The last parallel is the death of Jesus and the death of Benedict. And at the top, we see Jesus, who, in his total trust of God, allowed himself even to be crucified. But behind you see God, the Father, and the Spirit, who have been with him and supported him through all and bring him to new life. You already begin to see the resurrection in Jesus' golden garb and halo. St. Benedict below, it says, at the moment of his death, he has this great vision. He sees everything, the whole world, in a single ray of light. In other words, he sees all things in the light of God. And then Gregory tells us that surrounded by his monks who are praying for him, his soul ascends to God. So this large window in the east side is we call the Benedictine Window, because it portrays much of the life and work of Sacred Heart Monastery at the time this chapel was built in the late 40s to 1950. At the very top, you see symbols of prayer and work. The candle related to many of our liturgical functions, and the spade indicating work. So in here you see many of the works of the sisters, too many to mention, but I want to point out two things. On the far right, second set down from the top, as it's just an interesting note of design. In the foreground, you see a sister who is bringing in some of the fruits of the earth, which we did then and still do, by the way. We have a large garden and orchard. But in the background, you see in silhouette this chapel, which is intentionally placed in the design. In the fourth set down on the left side, you see one of the works that brought our sisters here, a sister teaching a young Indian child to pray the rosary. But next to her, you see two sisters playing croquet. Now, that indicates the third element that Benedict in his rule really included besides prayer and work, and that was holy leisure. Benedict knew there was need for psychic and physical and mental space occasionally to renew oneself, especially in the presence of God. So that might be anything from playing games, to reading, to doing art, to study of Scripture, to simply being silent with God. There are 2 sets of windows amounting to 4 scenes on this side of the chapel. These are related to 8 hours of prayer, an hour here meaning a particular time of day. In the original rule of Benedict, there were 8 times a day where a monastic community would gather for communal prayer. And the names of these hours are written in Latin. And you see various symbols from Christian history, from church writings, and so on in all of them. Today, in response to documents of Vatican II, to return to our original rule, we went back and tried to heed St. Benedict's statement that you need to adapt to the time and place in which you find yourself. And if you feel there is need to change what he has laid out for the hours, to do so. So today, we gather 4 times a day for prayer as a community, besides the liturgy of the Mass. So morning, noon, evening before the evening meal, and then a night prayer. The window on the east end of the side transept chapel is called the Marion Window. And in it we see 3 great moments in the life of Mary, the mother of Jesus. The Annunciation, the angel comes to tell her that she has been chosen to be the mother of the Savior. The next part is the visitation, when she goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John the Baptist. And the third is the birth of Jesus. Now, below that, this is puzzling to some people. Why is you sort of a patriotic-looking symbol there? That is intentional, because Mary is, according in the Catholic Church, is the patroness of the United States. This is a Catholic custom. Many countries choose a saint as the patron of that country. And also, 1950, the year this chapel was finished, was declared a Marian year in the Church of the United States, a year to especially honor Mary.